Hey, do you want to come over and make a pot of tea, bring your favorite crystals? We could talk about our birth charts, spirits, the latest house spells we've been doing. Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm that witch next door. Hello, my friend. Hi, neighbor. Welcome back to That Witch podcast. If this is your first time here with us in the neighborhood, hello and welcome straight from me. I'm Danny. I'm That Witch Next Door, and I am going to be your guide in today learning about death witchcraft and death magic. I consider myself to be a death witch, and whenever I mention this, whenever it gets brought up in an episode, which isn't crazy frequently, it's certainly not in back-to-back episodes usually, it always comes with an influx in inquiries and questions from everyone in the neighborhood. And I talked about it recently. I can't even remember which episode it was. And the exact same thing happened. And I've had several, both listeners and students in my school, that witch school, that have asked me more about it. And each one's question is structured very, very similar. Danny, I am reaching out because you mentioned this, or I've heard of this previously, and then you mentioned it. But I want to learn more about death magic and death witchcraft. I feel called to this for X, Y, and Z, or maybe I'm not really sure exactly why, but I feel really drawn. Can you provide me with any resources, books, anywhere that I can get started learning more about how to go about doing this? And very, very similar to our question about shadow work that I get very frequently. I have such a hard time answering this question via text or message because it really requires an in-depth and well-rounded answer to get you started, not necessarily in the quote-unquote right direction, but in an effective direction. So you're actually moving in a constructive direction. So, big disclaimer at the top of the show. First and foremost, I am one source of information. And more specifically, when it comes to death witchcraft, I am one source of about 5 years of experience. Okay. I really embraced and embodied the idea of being a death witch, and I started intentionally practicing this branch of magic in early 2019. And since then, let me just say, since the beginning of learning about this branch of witchcraft, my understanding of it, my shaping of it has undergone so much transformation, which is almost a pun because that's so much of the core of death magic and death witchcraft, because death, like life and rebirth, is a part of the overall equation that is transformation. Transformation does not exist without death. So I am here and happy to have you with me, and more than excited to give you and look into my death witchcraft practice, how it's kind of gone for me, what I've learned along the way, what it means and what it is to me up until this point. But if you go back and listen to the very, very first time I even talked about being a death witch on That Witch podcast, which was November 2021, if you want to scroll back and listen to it, it's changed and morphed so much. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my experience up until now. But I would not be surprised at all if another episode like this comes back in another year or two, because this is always evolving and I am always learning so much more. Because honestly, in the spectrum of life and practicing magic 5 years, like, in so many ways, I'm still a baby myself. And I totally recognize that that 5 years can feel like 50 years to somebody who has 0 years practice so far. So I'm happy to give you whatever I can, my friend, but take all of this with a grain of salt. And more than that, take all of this and run with it. Run to the hills with it. Take the parts that really resonate, really electrify you, light you up. Leave whatever just flat out does not fit for you, your beliefs, and your practice, and let this form of witchcraft take its shape for you. So, the way that I came into this is one of my favorite little stories to tell about myself, about my story. Says the Leo rising. This is one of my favorite stories to tell about myself. So 5 years ago, I was at a point in my witchcraft very, very similar to where I was at in 2023, actually, which is really, really interesting and fascinating to think about. I had been practicing witchcraft for 3 going on 4 years at that point in an official sense. Those of us who practice magic later in life and weren't raised on it and it wasn't in our families and taught to us or passed down in that way, and we reconnected with this lifestyle in adulthood in this life. You probably also have that experience of, you look back on your teenage years and you look back on your childhood and you're like, well, I mean, I was definitely practicing witchcraft. I just didn't realize that that's what I was doing. That's for sure. I definitely wasn't doing it with clear aligned intention, which is what I love about embracing the concept of being a witch and moving through it with much more intentional intention. How's that? So I am 3 going on 4 years into really, really practicing witchcraft on a daily life basis. By this point, I'm definitely considering myself an intermediate going into advanced witch, which, that's all super relative and subjective anyways, but it is still funny looking back and thinking about that. And I was looking to really level up my practice at that time. It was at that first rung of really feeling like I got the basics. I get it. I'm doing the basics. I'm comfortable. I get all that. Now, more. I need more magic. There's more witchiness. It's a divine hunger and divine thirst, I would say, that you have at that point. And I was listening to different magical podcasts and trying some out, feeling out different hosts. I'm sure those of you that are a listener here, you gotta jive with the host. And it's totally okay if you don't drive with one. It's okay if you don't drive with me. But you gotta find those ones that, they speak your soul language. And I come across this podcast called Which Said What. And Which Said What was, in my opinion, this amazing podcast. And before you go digging for it, I don't even know if it's still available on platforms or not anymore. Unfortunately, she did end her podcast relatively soon after starting it. There weren't terribly too many episodes, but there was a good enough chunk on there. It was still active when I first listened to it back then. And she did an episode on how she is a death witch and what that means and how she figured out that she was one. And this is one of those cool stories that parallels that. And that's what I love about humans and the archetype of all of our journeys and stories, because they mirror and parallel each other. Because what her podcast and episode did for me, and her telling her story could very well be doing that for somebody right now while I'm talking, which is just the coolest thing to think about. So she talked about being a death witch, these different associations with it, how, and so if you have any of these associations, you might also be called to death magic and death witchcraft. And it rang all my bells, like ring a ding. Like I was like, yep. Like I've never been so sure this is 100%. I am this. How do I learn more about this? I already knew or could tell or sense that this was a branch of magic that I was going to have to kind of go really digging for. And I am very happy to report that since then, I feel like it's either gaining in popularity or all the death witches started seeing the other death witches talk about this stuff and we're like, well, I do that too. I want to talk about it. And it's this beautiful chain reaction because I have just found more and more and more resources over the years. And I hope that you'll be able to find that as well. That just keeps growing and booming. But at the time, it felt really, really hard to find anything. So I reached out to her. I reached out to her after the episode and I sent her a message on Instagram. And I was like, okay, how do I even get started doing this? Just like the messages that I get on Instagram now. And she was so kind, and she listened to a couple of fears that I had. I specifically brought up in the message, I think I'm a death witch. I want to learn more about this. I definitely feel particularly called to communicating more with spirits, but I definitely feel this blockage and I definitely feel this fear. That was a big part of my question. It was the main part that she addressed with me over Instagram. And it wasn't even a terribly humongous long message, but it was really profound and really helpful for me because she was able to help me recognize something really, really, really important and really valuable. And this is exactly why I'm going into this first, the beginning of the episode. Because I think that's when it's the most helpful, is at the beginning, if possible, of one's death witchcraft journey. But she helped me reframe my label of fear. And she said, when you sense a presence, is it truly fear that you're experiencing? Or is it like anxiousness and anxiety and like being uncomfortable with the unknown and the unfamiliar because this is new and you don't really know it yet? And she told me that being able to make that distinction was going to be so, so helpful in really embracing myself as a death witch and ultimately strengthening my skills in spirit communication. Because fear can be a very informative tool. And when we really experience true intuitive fear, like danger, Will Robinson, get away from this thing, that's important. It's important to have that radar going and active and clear. But that is a very, very different thing than the fear of the unknown. Because the unknown is not automatically dangerous, is not automatically malicious. So this was pretty groundbreaking for me. And it planted, as you can tell, it really planted a seed that rooted in me. So I listened to that episode multiple times. And what's really funny is it wasn't even that. I think it was like a 30-minute episode. And it's probably going to be very similar to what I give today. It'll be really cool to see the progression of my Death Witch episodes over the years when we have another one after this, compared to the first and then this one and then that. But I would listen to it over and over again. And then I just took to the internet and I started Googling and I started learning as much as I could. Well, simultaneously around this time, I also was ready to embark on my first official work with a deity or with deities. And up until that point, I had not worked with, I don't think at all. I don't even think on like a one-off basis that I had worked with a deity yet. I'd worked with allies, like plant allies and crystal allies and animal spirit allies and symbols and things like that. I believe I had worked with the 4 directions. I worked with the elements a lot, and I definitely had worked with the seasons, and that was like a really working with the seasons was probably the first most natural part of my craft that came to me, and working with the energy of the seasons that just has always made sense to me. That's one of those things I was doing long before identifying as a witch. And I look back and I see how I experienced seasons, and I'm like, yeah, you were practicing energy work and witchcraft. You just didn't know that's exactly what it was. So I also started searching. Well, I was trying to peel back the layers because I did believe that a deity had been reaching out to me. And I did a spread that I think I found on Pinterest, and I can't even remember, and interpreted it and realized that Hades, god, king of the underworld, had been reaching out to me for a very long time. And it was one of those things where as soon as I realized it, it was like every single day that passed after that, more and more and more memories would come to me and would resurface from like younger and younger and younger years. And it was just like, oh my God. And the connections just flooded and snowballed and domino affected after that. It ramped up exponentially. I was like, oh my God, and this and this and this happened and this, and I saw this. Yeah. So I started studying Hades. And when you start studying Hades devotion, Hades worship, or if you start studying and looking up working with underworld deities or entities and beings of the underworld, what's underworld magic? What is the underworld to witches? If you just start like going down that realm, you're going to land in death witchcraft somewhere along the way. You're going to learn about it. And so much of it goes hand in hand. I do want to say, you do not have to work with deities if you don't want to, or if you don't feel called to, or if you don't feel comfortable to. And you can still practice death witchcraft. They went hand in hand for me right off the bat because that's how the journey was meant to go for me. And I leaned into it and I just embraced that early on. Some of the most common associations, if you're looking for like, what are some of the things associated with being a death witch that might tell me that I am one? I want to tell you something. When I ask you in these episodes, are you a green witch? Are you a kitchen witch? Are you a death witch? When I ask you those things, are you a cosmic witch? I hope you know, and I think I say this on all of those episodes, I hope you know that you ultimately get to decide that. That answer gets to be yes or it gets to be no. You ultimately get to decide that. Having that way of thinking like I did in my earlier years, oh, I can't participate in XYZ part of the occult or spirituality or witchcraft because I wasn't born that way or I wasn't raised that way or it's not in my family. None of that stuff really exists. Those things exist as experiences, but they're not exclusive to whether or not you are a witch or a certain type of witch. Now, there are specific folk practices, types of magic, and types of spirituality that are literally directly born from specific cultures and are reserved for those specific cultures. And those types of rituals, those types of practices, those types of initiations All of those things are literally passed down generation to generation or family to family within that culture. What I'm talking about are the overarching general open forms of magic and ritual practice, and you get to decide that. So I will say that the best way to say it is you might enjoy or you might resonate with death magic and death witchery if you are really drawn to things like skulls and bones, whether that's literally like being drawn to using them in your magic, like using teeth or bones or anything, all ethically sourced, of course. Um, if you are just drawn to skulls and skeletons and like ghosts as symbols in general, if you are particularly strongly drawn to and called by Samhain, and I would even throw in Yule, by the way. I think that Yule would be a fair one as well. Very commonly associated with death witchcraft because the mark of winter is very, very associated with death, my friends. Of course, everything dies at that time. I read somewhere that if you are drawn to or enjoy anything like spooky or of the horror genre, even like true crime and murder, and learning about all of that, those can also be indicators that you might really enjoy this type of magic and this type of work. If you enjoy or are fascinated by learning about death culture and death practices within your own community or the cultures across the globe, that can be another indicator. Honestly, being particularly interested in history in general is another one because history, the further and further we go back, is the study of dead people. And I'm just going to be blunt about it, okay? The trigger warning is in the title that this is about death, so I'm not going to use all the polite passed on people. No, it's studying about dead people in history because they all died. And this is part of death witchcraft too, is learning how, if you aren't already comfortable with speaking about death and communicating about this very, very natural part of our existence. That's definitely a big, big connected element as well. Let's see here. Working with, like I said, not just dead animals and their bones or their furs or their feathers, but also dead plants and preserving them and working with them and preserving a plant that's died is giving it rebirth and giving it a new purpose. And this is the same concept as utilizing bones and furs and teeth and feathers, again, all of which are ethically sourced. In your practice or around your home, this gives them another life and it honors the life that they lived before that. Working with your ancestors and deceased loved ones. If you feel called to the spirit realm in general, that's another big indicator that death witchcraft may be calling you or may be for you. So for me, for example, some of my earliest memories is being and not just earliest but long standing is being obsessed with the paranormal, specifically ghosts, spirits, experiences that people have had immediately post-mortem after someone close to them has just passed away or someone that they witnessed. Especially, I have read over the years, I've probably read thousands of stories because it seriously became one of my earliest obsessions. I would check out books in the library before the Google, before before the Google. I sounded like an old lady. That was hilarious. Oh, that was funny. Before the Google, I would check out books. I'm not just talking about like ghost stories as in legends. I mean, I want to hear your paranormal experience. I want to hear about, and I just was obsessed with that so much of my knowledge around the spirit realm and spirits has honestly been through reading through thousands of people's experiences from around the world. There are so many fucking books out there that that authors would reach out to people or people would submit their stories to them. There are all kinds of publications, I'm sure, online that also put this out. They're even on what's it called? BuzzFeed. When I was in college on BuzzFeed, anytime BuzzFeed put out one of their little time waster lists that I would look at while I was supposed to be working, about like creepy things that little kids have said about their past lives and stuff like that, or people's near-death experiences, or these are stories people had that nurses and doctors and any type of worker, like custodial worker or whatever, that works in a hospital or works in a hospice or works in assisted living homes where people pass away frequently, or there's a lot of near-death experiences. I've read so many stories. Some writers, they really like dig in. They like dig into one or two, or like a certain city, a certain building, and they like really dig into the history of a place and like get into, and then there's people like me that I'm like, I want to hear as many stories from as many people as possible. And like, some of them are believers of the paranormal. But do you know how many stories I've also read from people that are not even believers of anything spiritual or paranormal? And it's absolutely fascinating. So that is an excellent, excellent way to learn about the spirit realm in general, just so you know. But even just having pictures of your ancestors and deceased loved ones on your altar or around your home or in a special place where you can go and like honor them, or speaking with your past loved ones, writing them letters in your journal, buying their favorite flowers, wearing their favorite color, any of these ways we connect with someone that we love that has died, that is death witchcraft, even if you're not a death witch, by the way. And that's the other thing I wanted to tell you. You also don't have to full-blown identify as that. You can say fuck it to all labels. Labels should only feel empowering, not limiting anyways. So you don't even have to embrace the label itself to engage in and to be inspired by some of these practices, because this is such ancient sacred work, my friends. Like, this is such ancient sacred work. I even wrote down, honestly, fungi is death magic. And that is the correct way to pronounce what we've all been saying is fungi, but it is fungi. And I am here to say that on behalf of watching one documentary on Netflix. So this idea of an entire species that lives on the decomposition and the decomposing of living beings that have died, that's the most fucking heavy metal witchcraft thing ever. Mushrooms are fucking wild, dude. Spores and shit, like mycelium, that it is a fascinating world. Honestly, being into mycology in general, which is the study of mushrooms and fungi, that's death witchcraft, my friends. 1,000,000%. It would also fall under being a green witch, even though fungi are not plants. They're actually closer related to humans, which is, again, is one documentary, but it really left a mark on me. I'll drop it in the show notes below. Especially for those of you that are like, yes, mushrooms are my thing. Or if that is the case, you probably already know the documentary that I'm talking about, and you're like, yeah. So there are so many examples throughout our world where we can connect with the sanctity of death. Just like there are so many examples in so many ways that we can also connect with the sanctity of life. And when we realize that those are two sides of the same coin that equal transformation and equal the cycles and the movement and the existence of our universe as a whole, you can see why this magic is so powerful. I also know that, of course, it probably feels really scary and it probably feels really intimidating. And there's probably a good portion of people that hear the phrase and term death witchcraft and think that this is quote unquote dark and evil. First of all, I don't really even like using the word dark to describe something negative. There's so many aspects of dark magic that are sacred and necessary, like shadow work, for example. Working with the dark and that which we cannot see does not equal negative and malicious. And I totally recognize why the dark feels really intimidating and really, really scary. And in a lot of ways, my friend, that's because it's supposed to. Death work and any kind of dark work gets us to walk into uncharted territory that's already in the dark, and we still have to have our eyes closed. And that is scary for us who have been conditioned and programmed for many, many generations and many centuries now to strongly rely upon that which we can see, that which we can feel, taste, smell, and touch, and hear, that which we can prove exists. And the dark magic, the shadowy kind of magic, things like death work, well, there is so much of it. It's a foundational layer, quite honestly, that is purposefully never to be seen. This is why houses in astrology, like the 4th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house, yes, the water houses, are very associated with the deep, the dark, the shadowy, the unseen, the unconscious. Because water and our ethereal, esoteric part of our existence here is formless, and we can't see it and we can't feel it, and it doesn't make sense to the logic centers of our brain. And so for a very long time, we've been conditioned that therefore it's either bad, evil, and scary, or it's pointless and it's nonsense and it doesn't exist. I believe that death witches are called to this type of work to help heal our collective wounds and traumas and shadows around death itself, which again is a part of this whole greater equation that is life and existence in the universe. Death is a part of it. And for way too long now, we have been demonizing death, running from it, avoiding it, pissing all over it. And don't get me wrong. What do you think I enjoy it? You think I enjoy losing people to death and losing things to death? Fuck no. Unfortunately, grief is a part of it. There also is no life or rebirth without it. And you avoid and you shame and you demonize all of those things, and you try to cover up and suppress death as a society, and you will inevitably do the same to the other end of the spectrum. Embracing death, therefore, is also about embracing life and vice versa. So, what are some resources? How can you get started? What are tangible ways to practice death magic and death witchcraft? Well, first of all, going back and listening to a lot of the different traits and qualities associated with it and really deep diving and researching for yourself into any of those areas and categories is an excellent place to start. And it's one I highly recommend that you do. Just the act of looking into it and researching it is an offering, is an act of honoring for the practice itself. Okay, it's huge. Building your knowledge and getting your logic center, getting your right brain on board. Getting your left brain on board, your logic brain. That is humongous. That is a huge part of the practice. Okay, so that's why I don't want you to be afraid to go on and start researching new things. And if you notice, the things that I listed out really don't have anything to do with actual witchcraft yet. We'll bring that part in here in just a second. First, it starts with the studying of the reconnecting with the concept of death and embracing the fact and the notion that it is sacred and it is magic in and of itself. Those of us with major anxiety, hello, raising my hand right here, I have ginormous fears around death. Even as a death witch, 100 fucking percent, yes! Are you kidding me? Especially as a death witch, especially as an astrologer. My fears are confronted all the time by my practices. And good on you, mate. I'm serious because, sorry to all my Australian listeners who I just sounded like a freaking dum-dum too. That's hilarious. But I'm serious. I really do believe that is part of the purpose of my being a death witch. I am grateful that it mirrors and therefore confronts my own fears, because that means that I am continuously doing my own shadow work, my own introspective work around my own difficult connection with this sacred part of our life. It's not that it's meant to be easy and happy when we lose somebody. I do believe, especially if you look at the 7 stages of grief and you apply it into witchcraft in a spiritual sense, I believe that acceptance is a big part of the sanctity of death and death work. And I think that if you spoke with a death doula, a person who helps people and or animals transition physically out of this life and into their death and into the beyond, I think that you would find an agreeance there. I think you would also still find a human being who would be grief-stricken when they experience death of a close loved one. Erasing that is not part of it. It's not part of it. And I really do believe in the growth, personally and collectively, that this work does and can offer. So how do we bring this into our actual witchcraft? First, finding resources that resonate with you, that you can continue learning from, or that your learning can kind of continue branching out and rooting out from, is really, really important. So I have listed my personal favorite resources in the show notes below. Please remember, this is not an exhaustive list at all. This list would be infinite, probably. There are so many great resources. I listed what works really well for me. What I suggest in branching further from here is everything that I'm listing. Yeah, all of the ones that I'm listing all are on a social media platform like Instagram. And I really love using Instagram following and followers as a tool when I'm trying to branch out and diversify who and what I'm learning, who from and what I'm learning. Uh, Go to resources like these and go to their page and see who they're following, see who they recommend, see what books, podcasts, articles, workshops, other creators that they highly recommend. And this is how you can really start to blow up your learning network. Okay. But I listed some of my favorites in the show notes below. The Sonic Witch is one that I only recently started following toward the end of 2023. I also followed Angelica Crazy. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and I really apologize if I pronounce any of these incorrectly. She is specifically a devotee and daughter of Hades, as I am as well. And so that's been really, really cool following her account and her content as well, for that specific Hades worship and Hades devotion. Thonic Witch works with underworld deities, and witch and magic practices as well. So very, very helpful. Thonic Witch and Dirt Diaries, also on Instagram, they host Sticks and Bones podcast, and Sticks spelled STYX. Okay. So that can be an excellent place to start as well. Dirt Diaries does some seriously, seriously cool historical content, especially through the death lens. By the way, these sources came to me from my wonderful, wonderful friend, colleague, and client, Andrea, the Untamed Dame of Lunar and Obsidian. You can also follow Andrea and go and support her. She does some really, really cool stuff. But Andrea, and she always reaches out to me when she finds something or comes across something that she thinks that I'll like, especially in the witchcraft space. And so she is who turned me on to the Sticks and Bones podcast. And from there, I also followed the hosts pages on Instagram, which is Dirt Diaries and Thonic Witch. Quick side note, little mini sidestep here. You might come upon this word relatively frequently in your journey, your research journey, by the way. The word thonic. This is spelled CHTHONIC. And by the way, just as a written word and a word pronounced, it's just really pretty and I love it so much. But this means of the underworld, and it's working with and anything associated with beings or themes or symbols of the underworld, okay? So you'll see people refer to it as chthonic deities very, very often. We talked about Angelica and her awesome resource for being a Hades worshiper. Also, the graveyard roses. Now, I've recommended Aubrey on here multiple times. I love her content. I love her astrology content. I've taken a workshop from her. I purchased her Oracle of Pluto deck. She also is a follower and a worker of Pluto and Plutonian work, aka Hades. And so even though that's not her like main focus all of the time, it's something she still puts out information on pretty relatively frequently. And so she's also a great one to follow as well. So this brings me to Death Doula LA. Now, Death Doula LA was recommended to me by one of my other amazing clients, Kelsey. And I believe, if memory serves, Kelsey, my client, she did a course and signed up and did an online course with Death Doula LA. Death Doula LA is a nice sized account with lots of great information, especially on the practices of being a death doula, what that is, how to get into that, educational resources and offerings. So that is a super, super helpful resources for anybody specifically drawn to that branch of death magic, okay? And then finally, one of my oldest resources I've been following at this time, they haven't been very active on Instagram. However, their Etsy shop, the last time I checked, was still active and available. And their, I'm going to date myself or age myself with this, their Tumblr account, even if they're not super, super active on there anymore, it's the account itself is still active and it is a treasure trove of information. And that, my friends, is Death Witch Envy. On Instagram, it's death.witch.envy. Again, all of these are with their correct handles and links are in the show notes below. But if you get on the internet to also search for their Etsy shop, Death Witch Envy had some really helpful zines that you could purchase about death witchcraft, for example, about Hades worship and working with Persephone. And I first found Death Witch Envy on Tumblr, like I said. Tumblr is this secretly like abundant space for learning about deity worship. I loved it, especially not just for education, but it was a great space to have a digital altar. There are a ton of Hellenistic witches on there. There are tons of witches and magic practitioners that work with deities from all sorts of pantheons on there. And they post not just pictures of the aesthetic and the vibes associated with certain deities or certain mythologies or certain cultures or certain practices, but a ton of them post really, really informative posts as well. So I always like to turn people back to Tumblr because Tumblr's still alive and it's still just as awesome. So shout out to all my millennials on here because I'm telling you, go to Tumblr and look up death witchcraft, or like I said, just look up deity worship, or Hellenistic witchcraft, or Roman witchcraft, you know, whatever, Norse witchcraft, whatever your pantheon is that you want to go with, and you will find a well of information. So those are some of my favorite places for you to get started. You can go to the links in the show notes below. And like I said, my little tip about branching off from there, take a look at who they're following, where they're also learning from, who inspires them on their social media. That is a great way to diversify and expand on your resources list, okay? Now, some ways for bringing this into your witchcraft. This list could be 2 fucking hours long. And y'all, we don't have that kind of time. I'm already like really getting into it here. So first and foremost, anything to do with necromancy. Necromancy is the communication with spirits for divination. So cartomancy is that same practice, but with tarot cards or cards of any kind. Necromancy, the root word there is necro, which is death. It's communing with death or those who have died for sacred information. Some people use that to predict the future, but other people, it's just divine messages, similar to the way that we channel information from astrology in a birth chart, for example, okay? So any books, any articles on necromancy, spirit work in general, safe spirit communication, that is an episode we are going to get to relatively soon. So don't worry if you want me to go in depth with that. I hear you, and we will be doing it. But learning from anyone that practices ancestor work, mediumship, these are, and you know, do your due diligence. Look into people. See what their engagement is like on social media. Read their about me on their page. Look for their morals and their ethical code, okay? If you get a weird vibe, you're getting a weird vibe. If the vibe, remember what my message was to me in my early stage, where you're at right now, at the beginning of this whole episode. Learn now to distinguish the difference between true fear and an off vibe and, oh, I'm a little nervous, this is the unknown. I don't really know what I'm getting into here. Learn to distinguish both, okay? And err on the side of caution. I think that would be a safe way to say it. Err on the side of caution. people have been exploiting other people's grief for thousands of years. Okay? And it's certainly not stopping now. So be vigilant out there. Make that intuition guide you at the forefront the whole time. I promise you'll find who you're meant to find. And if it's not like a full-bodied fuck yes, then it's okay that it's a fuck no, and we need to move on from that, okay? If that book, that article, that person is putting out information about death and practices that just do not feel right with you, that's okay. Move along, my friend. Don't worry. Okay. Any kind of ancestor work, any type of spirit work, like I said, whether it's communing with them, meditating with them, honoring them on your altar, asking them for advice, writing them letters, things like what's called a dumb dinner, where you cook food for the people that have died before you, and you set a full plate of food for them at the table with an empty seat and chair and everything like that, and you eat the whole dinner in silence while honoring their memory, welcoming their spirit. I highly recommend doing this after grounding, cleansing, and protecting your energy, and specifically calling upon only the spirits that are invited to that dinner at that particular time, okay? I really apologize for my cough, by the way, everybody. So, another form of making death work spiritual is to get a death chart reading or to do one for yourself. Same thing goes for doing or getting a grief tarot spread or tarot reading for yourself. With all of these, honestly, proceed with caution. This can obviously be incredibly triggering work, and that's why you need to make sure you're moving through it safely and responsibly for yourself. Don't ask questions and don't pull up a chart that you really, truly, deep down don't want to see or hear, okay? It's okay. It's okay. I have been able to find a lot of solace and a lot of purpose in death charts. And a death chart is exactly what it sounds like. It's the time, place, and date that a person died. And you look at the chart and you interpret where they were at in their life at that time. You read it like a transit chart and the overall purpose of it. If you have that information, that date, time, and place, you can also put it in as a transit for your own birth chart and see what role or what purpose that death has or had for you in this particular life. Again, I do not recommend doing this unless you really do want to know. And my friend, it's okay if you don't really want to know. Don't pull up the chart. Might also just be that you need to do it at a later date. It might be too soon, okay? But it's something that whether you're pulling tarot cards for it, or you're inviting a medium over, or you are asking someone to channel messages from a passed on loved one, or you're pulling a death chart. Any of those things can be too much too soon. So be sensitive to yourself and be sensitive to others, okay? There's a reason I don't really offer this work professionally. I do technically, as in if I'm already working with a client and it's going to have some benefit in the work that we're doing together, and it's clearly I can tell or I'm given the message that this is a reason that this person was brought to me, I will do death work with them. But there's a reason I don't advertise it and promote it and sell it. This is very, very, very sensitive work, okay? Super, super sensitive work where you need to be honestly like officially trauma informed and educated in that space. It's not something to be light and dilly-dally with at all. It's not something to be like terrified of, but it's something to take seriously and to be very, very respectful about with all parties involved, the spirits involved, the people involved, and yourself, okay? Another big question that I want to address here at the end to kind of leave you off with is, should you help people cross over? And I'm not talking about living people. I'm not talking about being a death doula. A death doula is helping someone who's currently experiencing physical death, like in a hospice or on their deathbed, transition into death physically and spiritually. I'm talking about people that feel called to help spirits cross over, haunted spirits with unfinished business, believed to be stuck on an in-between plane, and help them cross over into the great beyond, if you will. There is a lot of very well-founded debate around all of this. And I really do see all sides. And when I first came into death witchcraft, I was like a lot of you probably are, where I was like, that's really cool. What a cool, kind thing that you can do. But the more you learn from, just like I said, just read stories, my friend. If it's one tip you take away from today, just read everyone's stories possible. Read stories from regular folk, from muggles. Read stories from people that work in very death-associated professions like hospitals and stuff. Read stories from mediums that have had experiences with people. Read as many stories and experiences as you can, and let that help guide your own direction and footing. If you read from a lot of mediums, many will tell you that we can't possibly know the full scope of one's journey, including their spirit journey. And if we zoom out far enough, what if there is a purpose to that spirit being on that plane, quote unquote, stuck the way that we perceive it to be? What if that is part of their journey and that needs to be? So there's valid points on all sides. I think that it sounds like it, on its base level intentions, it's supposed to be a helpful, kind, merciful thing to do. I also think that taking it upon yourself as your responsibility to go physically to places to help spirits cross over, you're going to start venturing into the realm of some controversial, potentially unethical, or just irresponsible and maybe even harmful practices, meaning could be harmful or dangerous to you or others around you. So, energetically speaking, I mean, maybe even physically speaking. So, I personally will say, if you were meant to help a spirit cross over, I think that those very individual experiences will happen and will come to you organically. You know, like if there was someone that you know and loved that passed on, then you can sense that their spirit has been sticking around because you or other people have had a hard time releasing them and letting them go. And maybe you can offer a message to their spirit that even though it's really hard and people are experiencing heartbreak without them, that it is okay for them to let go and it is okay for them to move on. That is a beautiful example, a very individual example, and very, very different than I have heard of people saying, I think that it's my responsibility to go to graveyards and sense whatever restless spirits are there and help as many crossover as possible. There's a whole lot there that you don't know, that I don't know, that nobody knows, because that's a lot of people and a lot of spirits and a lot of soul journeys in it. You're really taking a lot on faith there that you know the grander design for all of that and the grander purpose for all of that. And again, we can start venturing into some potentially unethical or unsafe spaces. So take all of this, okay? Take it in. This might be one you do need to listen to again eventually. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or need any further clarification on different parts of this episode. But my intention with it was that it was at least able to answer the majority of people's questions and inquiries about this type of work. But I'm an open book. I am happy to share with you what I at least know. I'll never claim to know shit that I don't, quite frankly. And I'll always do my best to point you in the right direction to hopefully a helpful resource that might know more than me. And that's what I'm here to do, my friends. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that it was beneficial for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time with me here today and every day. I hope that, of course, you stay safe out there. You let yourselves have some damn fun. And of course, make sure you stay magical, my friend. Did you get something valuable out of today's show? Here's how you can help continue to grow our magic. First, you can head over to Apple or Spotify and leave a 5-star rating and review. You can also share a shout out on your social media page and make sure you tag me at thatwitch.nextdoor. And of course, you can just tell a friend that you think would enjoy the show and send them a link to the episode. Thank you so much, neighbor, for your support. I'll see you next time.